Welcome to Seeking the Sacred Self. I'm your host, Naomi Rozak. Today, I want to talk about how to hear your inner voice. This is a topic I think that we don't talk about often enough, and because it isn't talked about, there's a lot of confusion, criticism, fear, judgment attached to the concept. And there are a lot of labels that get attached to people who seem to hear an inner voice or talk about it. And then, as well, when some people talk about their experience of hearing the inner voice, others get curious. They want to hear it too. They try to listen for their inner voice and feel bad when they can't hear it or don't have a clue how to access that inner voice. Sometimes the way we listen for it are not ways that actually work for us as individuals. And then some of you listening don't know what I'm talking about. If that's the case, listen to this episode and the next one for your interest's sake and see if something I'm talking about tugs at you a little bit, raises your curiosity about this experience. For today, it's enough to remind ourselves that if we have a self inside of us, a self that is whole, that sacred spark that was inside us when we were born, then that self or spark would have a purpose for being there. And the way to know that self would be to hear it speak. We would have to have some way of connecting to it, of coming to know it, of expressing it. So for this moment, let's either accept or pretend that having an inner voice is an actual thing and that this voice is a source of wisdom and knowing meant to guide us through our lives. This topic of how to hear your inner voice will be divided into 2 episodes. Today, I want to tell you the story of my search for that voice, how I knew something was missing in my life, and how over time I came to learn how the inner voice speaks and how I could hear and interact with it. And then next week, I'll share more details of what that might look like for all of us, and also the many access points and how individual and unique that inner voice connection is. I've explained in previous episodes that I was raised in a high demand church called the Message of the Hour. And in this church, I was taught a couple of things that were always at war with each other. One is that God was a close and personal and caring God. And the other is that God was an angry, watchful, vengeful judge. And so I lived with that war inside of me constantly. And I had this hunger inside to know God personally and to see him as a kind and caring father. As I've mentioned before, part of my story is that my parents divorced when I was 7.5, and my dad left our family. And what that seeded into my inner self is the idea that somebody can love you and leave, and that silence and absence is a part of a relationship where somebody once loved you. And so, in a way, when I looked at God as a father, I knew that the teaching said, yes, he's kind. Yes, he's caring. Yes, he watches over you tenderly like a shepherd with his flock. But I didn't feel any of that. And what I did feel was that God is absent. He's far away. He's an angry judge. He's waiting for me to mess up. As time went on and I grew old enough to have an awareness of these things, it just felt like I had a hungry heart all the time. When I prayed, it felt like my prayers reached the ceiling and bounced back down, like I was in an echo chamber. I just felt alone and abandoned and rejected. And I was searching all the time. I would listen so carefully to ministers as they preached, and I would wonder how. Like, they seem to project this idea that they're so close to God and they understand him so well. And all these people seem to have this emotional experience. They claim to know God. They claim to have answers in their prayers. But how? How do you get answers? How do you actually speak to and hear from God? There was always this part of me consistently on that search for how can I hear God? And if he's as close and as personal as we claim, why doesn't he speak to me no matter how hard I try? Now, there were times I felt I did have prayers answered. I remember somebody once offered me a trip. They were going to pay for me to visit a church I had been in. And I just wasn't sure about it. Something didn't feel right. And I went to pray about it. And this had never worked for me before, but this time I thought, oh, I'm just going to open my Bible and I'm going to put my finger on the page and whatever verse it is, like maybe that will be my answer. And I had tried this many times before because this was how some other people said that they got answers to prayer. And when I opened my Bible, my finger landed on a verse that said something like, is it a time for gifts? No, it's time to do like this or that. I don't remember the actual verse, but I realized that was my answer for that time. And I feel that this is how a lot of people in churches interact with their idea of God or their inner voice. They know only one avenue, which is what I call illumination. It's you are seeking something, you are asking for something, you are mulling over something in your mind, and then a thought or conversation or outward event or detail will grab your attention and highlight something specific, and it settles something in your heart. To me, that is still an interaction with your inner spark. So I did have that sometimes, but so very rarely. And it didn't satisfy that search for a personal relationship with God that I was looking for. I wanted to whisper in his ear and I wanted him to speak back to me. And the Bible is littered with examples of God speaking to people. And so I didn't see why this should be such a foreign or lofty experience or only reserved for certain people. It didn't make sense to me and I was hungry for it. I wanted it. And I think deep down, I was searching for a love that touched me in my heart, for someone who cared for me specifically and deeply and personally, something that could reach the core of me and didn't leave me feeling hungry and wanting and abandoned. So, fast forward a little bit because this was my story through teenagehood, and then I got married and had small children. And my husband at this time was filling in as an assistant pastor at the church where we were. And he also had a propensity for working well with people in counseling type situations. And our pastor was becoming aware that there was a need for more tools for people to heal their marriages, to address trauma and things like that. And he had come across the work of a counselor in Colorado Springs named John Regier. John was he might have been a Baptist pastor at one point. I think he was. And at this point, he was a Christian counselor who was doing like really wonderful things for people. Our pastor sent my husband and I and another couple from our church, and we met a third couple from somewhere else. And we all flew down to Colorado Springs to see what this counselor was doing and to learn some of his methods. So when we went there, it involved a full week of being there, and John would see one couple for counseling for 2 or 3 hours every morning, and then we would do a lunch break, and then he would see another couple for 2 or 3 hours in every afternoon. So each couple was seen 4 or 5 times. And each couple consented to being observed. They were in a room by themselves with John Regier, but they signed consent forms and knew that students of the method would be watching them on video from another room. So this was all above board. So ourselves and the two couples we knew, and I think there were 2 or 3 other couples from other types of churches and groups were there with us to witness this method. And what the method involved, what made it so unique, and I guess what made it so similar to therapy, even though John wasn't a licensed counselor, was that he would sit and listen to a couple talk for hours. Sometimes the first 2 days, they would only talk and talk and talk, and he would take notes. He might ask a few questions, but he just listened, and he listened without judgment. And sometimes he would pause the couple and ask the woman to explain more or the man to explain more. And he might point out to them something that he was observing in their dynamic, but he wouldn't go into why he felt it was there. He was just highlighting their pain points and the difficult dynamics that were going to keep occurring in their relationships. And then when he felt he had a good handle on what they were presenting, and he had listened with so much love and compassion, he wasn't judging anything they did. He had a bunch of worksheet type things that he would then present, and they were diagrams. They weren't things that the people had to do much work on themselves, but he would begin to show them how, for example, the daughters upbringing involved a lot of high expectations from her parents. And so she set a lot of high expectations on her husband. And then maybe he had grown up being criticized a lot. And so when his wife set high expectations on him, it would shut him down and he would then withdraw. And then she would feel emotionally abandoned the same way her father had abandoned her mother. It would trigger all these difficult things. And so John would just explain the dynamics. And he always said there are no marriage issues. There are only personal issues that come to a head because they bump up against somebody else's personal issues when people get married. And before I go further, I do want to say I know this is not licensed therapy. He was not formally trained, and there may even be questionable methods in what I share here. But what I do want to share is that we had never seen anything like this in the Message Church. Nobody had ever explained interpersonal dynamics, the effects of trauma, the damage to the emotional self that comes with childhood events. Nobody had labeled those and pointed them out for us. And what it did as we sat there and witnessed the couples is my husband and I, of course, you're listening with two sets of ears. You're listening with your learning ears to be able to know what these couples are experiencing and to be able to learn the method. But we were also applying those things to ourselves. And as my husband and I listened, we began to realize the dynamics of our own childhood environment and the things we had been through. And to be honest, they were something that I had felt for a long time. I knew that there was no emotional closeness in my home growing up. I knew I felt abandoned by my father. I knew that God felt far away from me. I knew there were other dynamics in our home, but what I hadn't ever been able to validate was how much those affected me, how much not being emotionally taken care of, even though all my physical needs were met, impacted me as a highly sensitive child and one who had been through a childhood trauma. And for my husband, he had his own things that were coming up. And interestingly, the dynamics of our childhood home were very similar in many ways. And so in our marriage, we were reenacting those dynamics. We were internalizing everything that happened and pulling away from each other because that was what had been modeled for us. We both felt on the inside like sad, lonely children that no one cared about. And so as we talked every evening about what we had learned and internalized, it started to create this beautiful connection between us. But what was more interesting to me was that after John had illustrated these dynamics to the couples, he would then lead them in something that he called listening prayer. And he explained it very simply. It was when you would take those difficult dynamics of your childhood and your heart to Jesus in prayer and ask a simple question. Something like, Jesus, were you there when my father criticized me all those times? What did that do to my heart, Jesus? Did you care that that happened to me? How can I heal this damage? You can see how childlike these questions are, how simple and from the heart they are. And some people might even scoff at this simplicity, but this method shook me to my core. I had never heard anything like it. And my hungry heart was dying for healing and for companionship and for closeness. And then what John explained was that what would happen is Jesus would prompt back something to the person to help resolve the pain and the loneliness of the issues they had been through. And this might be by showing them an image in their mind after they had asked the question. Or he might bring to them a scripture verse or a song lyric or a memory, something that signaled a feeling of comfort or peace or that the issue was complete and dealt with. And as I watched John carefully lead those couples in this listening prayer with these simple, heart centered questions, I would watch the pain wash away from these people. a load would drop off their shoulders and they would begin, like literally their skin would begin to glow, their countenance would shine, and they would find a new way to connect to each other in a different dynamic, without criticism, without escalating into yelling and accusing and judgment. And with their open hearts, they would be able to give each other what they needed based on what they hadn't got when they were younger or at the beginning of their marriage. And we literally watched the dynamics of those couples change. So as I went back home, my husband and I talked on the airplanes the whole way home. We were able to be there for each other in a way we never had, and we were building a closeness. But the question in my heart was, what will happen if I pray like this? I hadn't had a moment to be alone. When we got home, I had to pick up my toddlers, and then I think the next day was church. And so we were in church. But as we were in church, it was like something was different for me. The worship songs would be sung, and I had tears pouring down my face. It was like I could feel something I had never felt before in my life. And I think I've mentioned in other episodes that with the divorce of my parents, I had to shut down certain parts of myself because the feelings were too big. The environment was too difficult. The conflict was too hard. And in spending that week in Colorado Springs, something had reconnected inside of me. Some part of me had come back home, and I could feel my heart again. I could feel things in my heart. I could feel the lyrics of the songs. I could feel my precious little babies up against me. I remember after church that Sunday morning, I walked out to the kitchen in the church hall, and a friend was there, and she said, like, how are you doing? How was Colorado Springs? And she gave me a big hug, and I just felt this shock of sensation all the way through my body to my heart. I literally felt her love reach my heart, which is something I had never felt, I guess, in over 20 years since the divorce of my parents. And so something was definitely changing in me, but I just wanted to get back home and have some time to myself so I could do this listening prayer thing. The next morning was Monday morning, and it was all I could do to wait until my children were laid down for their morning naps. And when they did, I rushed into my bedroom. The bed was tidy, everything was tidy and quiet and alone. And I picked up my Bible and I started to ask God these questions. And I said, Jesus, were you there when I was a teenager, when my mother was working, and it felt like nobody cared for me and nobody saw me? What did that look like? And I got the image in my mind of me behind the bars of a jail cell. And on the other side was my family and my mother, and they were going about their business. And nobody saw me, and nobody knew that I was locked in this jail cell. And I broke down weeping because it was exactly the feeling I had lived with. And then I asked, what did that do to a little girl's heart? And the next image was literally the shape of a heart, but as if a cannonball had been blown through it and left a hole in the middle of it, and an empty heart, absolutely broken. And again, like this prompt was undeniable. This was the feeling I had had in my body. And so I was weeping because here I was personally Here I was personally talking to the God of the universe, and he was speaking back to me. I asked, what would you do for a little girl to help her heal these wounds? And I saw the typical pastoral Jesus in the white robe with the blue sash sitting on a rock, and on his knee was a little brown-haired girl in a blue dress with bright blue eyes. And she was talking to him a mile a minute, and his attention was entirely focused in on her with such love and presence shining out of his eyes. That was all it took for me. That moment of hearing the inner voice changed my life completely. That was April of 2012, and for the next 9 months, not every single day, but for many hours a week, I would sit with my journal and I would ask God questions, question after question after question about things we were going through with our kids, about unresolved things in our marriage, about our church, about all kinds of stuff. But at the same time, there were some issues coming up in our church about the foundations of the church, the founder of the church, William Branham, and about his truthfulness, about some of the things he claimed to have caused or experienced within his teaching ministry and healing ministry and things like that. And I'm going to leave that for another day because that's a long and involved story. But what I could do as all these issues came up, what I'd never been able to do before is I could go back to God and say, "What do you think about this?" Or, "God, I feel really afraid because if we keep questioning the doctrine of our church, I have no idea what's going to happen." Or even as the ministry of our church began to preach against people who were leaving or people who were doubting or having questions, and I could see that if we left at some point, things were going to go pretty badly. I could still go back to God and say, "Look, like, I don't know what's going to happen, but are we going to be okay?" And every time I would either receive the reassurance I need or a scripture verse would be highlighted that gave me more courage. And I was able to keep walking that road really with my hand in God's and feel absolute trust that I would be taken care of. And meanwhile, by listening to this voice, the most magical things were happening in how I parented, in how loved my children felt by me. The things like the mother rage that I had talked about in other episodes, the rage of a heart that wasn't healed and had never felt love. All of these things were being soothed and eased and changed because for the first time ever, I could feel that love and talk about those wounds and have a place that healed them for me. Until in February of 2013, my husband and I realized that it was time to leave the church. Not something we had ever planned on or anticipated. This church was going to be my path forever. And while I knew things were going to be hard if we left, I really hadn't expected them to be as terrible as they were because I felt like I was leaving to follow the truth and I felt like God had my back and this was all going to be okay. And instead, what happened was my world and my identity, everything I had believed in, the doctrine, the foundations of how I taught my kids and how I interacted with my husband and how I dressed and how I believed, just everything you can comprehend fell to pieces, smashed on the ground. Because if the doctrine of my church that I had been raised in, which was strict and detailed doctrine, if any of this was called into question, and if the character of the man, the prophet who taught it to us, was called into question, then I had to re-examine everything. And so there was these stark realizations that most of what I had been taught was either a lie or had a lot of questionable elements about it. I had to go through a lot of doctrinal shifts. And this also made me look back at God and say, wow, I spent almost 30 years in that church. And could God not have at any point let me know that a lot of this was an error? A lot of this was harmful to me? Could he have not intervened? Or even in the suffering I was going through right then, I could go to God and I could say, hey, like, I'm really hurting here. I have no friends anymore. I'm on my own. My children are hurting. They're crying because they can't see their friends. They miss them. We don't have any solid routine around spirituality anymore. And it was like I would get comfort for that moment For that moment, I would feel okay, but 5 minutes later or 2 hours later, the pain would be back. And every morning waking up just felt impossible, like I was facing a mountain every single day and could only make it 2 steps up and then would find myself slid back down to the bottom the next morning. And so it was just lonely and long and hard, and it kept on being that way. My husband and I did go to a local church nearby, a very warm-hearted, welcoming church. I plugged into the women's Bible study. Our kids went to their little kids programs, but even that was an adjustment. It was a different church. It was a large church, and a group full of people that we really didn't know. And though they were so welcoming, I didn't have a lot of trust in my heart either that this was even a permanent place for us or that people could be trusted. What I hadn't expected to happen was over the next couple of years, the same questioning process that I had used to examine what the message taught me, I began to turn around and have to apply the same questioning process to the Bible because as I read it, I began to find my own difficulties with some of the teachings in there and the way the character of God is displayed and some of the discrepancies between it. And slowly it felt like I was beginning to lose my faith. And I desperately didn't want to. At points in there, I'd thought of going to seminary. I wanted to be a great Bible teacher. I wanted to lead women's groups. I always had this spiritual side to me that felt like there was something out there for me to be fulfilled. And the more I went along, the more my whole foundation of the Bible and my beliefs was just crumbling away underneath me, and I was terrified. And I was also disillusioned and exhausted and just, I think, reaching the end of my tolerance for all of it. It felt like my image of God had changed when I left the message. He had become, biblical, basic Christian God versus message God. And then even Christian God, I began to have some trouble with. And so my relationship with this inner voice also began to change because I wasn't sure that I could trust it. And I would read things in my Bible and I would ask God about them, but I would get only like a vague answer. And that felt disturbing. And, a lot of the time the voice just said, just trust, just trust. It'll be okay, just trust. And I couldn't really trust anymore because this transition had been so much bigger and so much more violent and hurtful and difficult than anything I had ever imagined. There came a point where I think it was about 3 years, it was in between 2 and 3 years after we had left the message church that I realized my whole body was full of anxiety. My head had been thinking about theology for 4 years, a year before leaving the message and 3 years afterwards. And I couldn't even tolerate the questions anymore. And I wanted to trust this voice. I wanted to believe it, but it felt like it wasn't doing enough for me. It wasn't giving me enough help. It wasn't intervening enough. It wasn't fixing my life enough. And I just felt so angry and fed up that um, I decided I was finished listening. And I put all of my Bible books aside and I put the voice aside and I stopped journaling questions to it. And I had noticed that for all those 4 years of theology, it was like I was focused on something in my head and I was focused on eternal life after this life. But I had kids and I had a need to find a purpose in the life I was living now. I needed to find a way to be present in my body and, like with boots on the ground, live this real, present human life, not always be pie in the sky thinking. And so for the next couple of years, I just really worked on learning to live with my boots on the ground. I started to leave some of the message questions behind me, because when you've gone through something painful and traumatic for a time, you have to focus on the past. You have to process the past. But there comes a time where if you want to heal and move forward, you actually have to figure out how to move forward. And so I began by looking at what my interest was pulling me towards. I tried some new things. I did a lot of reflecting in my journal. When had I felt most fulfilled? What did I want to do with my life? I just spent a lot of time finding my way forward. And during that time, especially in like yoga class, I began to find an inner sense of myself that I'd never had before. I could feel things in my body. I could feel emotions in my body, in the different places in my body where they tended to be stored. We often store fear and anger around our hip area. We carry anxiety in the top of our torso, our shoulders, neck, upper chest. We carry grief in our lungs. And as I began this physical process of yoga, which is almost like physical meditation, I learned these different pathways of my body for sensing emotions and sensing when I'm uncomfortable and learning to be okay when I'm uncomfortable. That discomfort is not anything bad. It's just a state of being and we can move through it and be okay with it too. And what also began to happen as I found more connection to my body and myself and to people in my life is sometimes I began to get a sense of a voice speaking again, but whereas the voice of God or Jesus, I had always defined as something coming from outside of me that I heard inside me, whether it did or not, I don't have explanations for some of this. This voice was very internal and very deep down and very natural inside of me. And it felt like the truest part of me speaking. And so, if maybe I was going through a difficult time, all of a sudden this voice from inside would just say one phrase that would put me at peace. And because this voice felt so much a part of me, I could trust those little bits that came. And I still didn't seek it out. I didn't sit down with a journal and say, "Hey, voice, tell me all this stuff." I had some spiritual trauma here and I was not going to trust easily. And so for a couple of years, I learned, I guess, some of the laws of being present, how we are body, mind, and spirit. You can't neglect any of them. If you detach from one of those pieces, you are losing some of your ways of being present, some of your ways of being whole. But I still carried within me this spiritual trauma and this lack of trust for the voice that I had previously heard, which I had believed to be Jesus and felt to be Jesus. And then fast forward to 2018, some difficult things were happening in my family. I don't want to share them right here. I mean, in my extended family. And they were very triggering for me. They brought up a lot of feelings of how message people view people who have left the message or outsiders. And I had a lot of kind of anger and fear building up inside. And it was also bringing up questions of like, what happens after death? And there was a part of me also that felt exhausted of trying to present this one front to my extended family who were still in the message, and also juggling university and homeschooling my kids and marriage and household keeping and working, like the many things I was doing. It was just all too much. And I moved into a time of, I guess, what you would call a healing crisis, where my body just started screaming at me and saying, like, we cannot live like this. We have to figure out something different. And so, because one of my symptoms was a left eye shutting down, it felt like my left eye couldn't see, even though I knew it could. And when I covered my right eye, my left eye could see things. It just felt like it had shut down on me and wasn't showing up to do its work. And I felt a lot of strain around that eye. So, somebody told me about a natural vision practitioner in Edmonton, and I went to see her. Her name is Summer Bozahora. And she doesn't just work with the physical eye or, the prescription of the eye, but also what she calls insight, which is how our eyes are a window to the soul. They are a spiritual expression of our internal state. And she took me out of the little room where we had done like an introductory talk, and she moved me out to the main hallway where there was a vision chart at the end, and she asked me to cover my right eye and try to read the letters on the chart with my left, and I burst into tears because clearly there were emotions, there was difficulty coming up inside of me, and it was time to address it. And so she just ushered me back into her office and said, there's a process we can use to get in touch with the emotions and the emotional trauma that's behind your eye difficulty. And would you be open to that? And I said, yeah, for sure. And she popped me up on her massage table and turned out the lights, and there was just like a salt lamp in the corner giving a gentle glow. And she turned on some soft music. And as I laid there, she began to coach me into this state of internal awareness. And it truly was easy to access. And I didn't have any questions about it because she would say, oh, let's just tune into your left eye. What feelings are around your left eye? How old or what age are those feelings? Does your left eye want to say anything to you? And her questions helped me just move through this process. And in this process, I could again see internal images and these internal feelings and have knowledge come to me. So we worked with my two eyes in that session and the images that they brought up and the feelings and things they wanted to express. And Summer gave me some exercises to do and some more knowledge, and I went home. And then she, let me know that this internal process to provide inner insight was probably going to be the most helpful thing for my eye, because my eye issues had started right after my parents' divorce. Until then, my vision had been fine, and she felt that emotional trauma, was at the root of what was happening. Whereas for some people, it might be a car accident or a physical trauma or actual damage that brings them to work with her. I went home and I thought about what she had done, and I realized this process she took me into was very similar to listening prayer that I had learned from John Regier in Colorado Springs. And it was good for me. It was healing for me. There was something in it that I craved and wanted. And the most beautiful part to me was that I didn't have to relate to these images as if they were from God or Jesus. They weren't the result of prayer. It was simply the act of immersing into my own inner self, my own inner body. And naturally, these images would come up and these inner prompts. And so when we went back to my next session, I said to her, "This is just like listening prayer that I used to do many years ago, but it's not with God." And she was like, "Oh, okay." She doesn't need to judge anything. She helps people of all faiths and beliefs. And then we just moved into the second session. And in the second session was when a lot of my spiritual trauma came up. And I'm not going to give the details here, it's too much. Another time is better for this, and I have written about it in my book as well, and one day hope to share that. But I was able to express for the first time some of my feelings about God and how difficult it had been to be hungry for that period of, 25 or 30 years. And then the trauma that came from, being taught doctrine that tells you you are sinful and bad and wrong and separate from God and a lowly worm, and how God is always judging you, and then the trauma of believing so implicitly in this church system that I could trust and that helped me felt secure and I loved with my whole heart, and then finding out that so much of it was a lie. I was able to let that out on the table. And part of what came to light from these inner images and things inside me was that there was a spiritual path for me beyond religion, beyond the church I'd been in, and beyond that relationship with God that felt full of meanness and abandonment and lack of care. And that if I would continue on this path of being connected to myself and allowing myself to heal these wounds, allowing myself to see, feel, hear, know, and trust what was coming up from inside of me, I could heal myself, I could move forward, and I could also have some kind of spiritual connection. And here I just want to be honest with you that even though I shut down to that voice of God after leaving the Message Church and the Christian church, nothing else had ever anchored me and healed me and given me satisfaction the way the voice did in the intervening time. And there on Summer's table, I found that sense of spiritual connection again, except this time it wasn't farmed out to this idea of a faraway God. It was something intrinsic inside me. I, for the first time, could see and feel that spark of light inside me that is all knowing, that is full of wisdom, that had so much to share with me, so much potential and positivity and joy for my future. And it showed me that I could use it, I could access it at any point to receive the wisdom I needed for that day. To make a long story short, because I could fill pages and hours with the in-between stuff. What it eventually did was restored my sense of spiritual connection, not only to myself, but to an energetic universe all around me that only ever is there for my good, that only ever wants my support and my growth and my healing, that doesn't demand anything of me, that doesn't care one little bit if I even pay attention to it or have a certain belief or a label for it. It offers itself to anyone and anything that wants to connect to it, and it is full of all the wisdom of all the ages contained inside of it. You don't have to believe that. All I would want you to carry away from this is that no matter what you believe right now or what you've been through, there is an inner connection, an inner spark, an inner essence that you can interact with that can become your source of calm and stability and centeredness and balance, and even a foundation from which you grow and thrive and become authentic and access everything you could ever want. And it is inside of you. You do not have to abandon a piece of you to get there. You don't have to believe you are bad or wrong or sinful. You don't have to look at your difficult behaviors or difficult experiences as expressions of your heart. They're not an expression of your core self. They are an expression of the difficulty you have lived through, and they don't deserve your judgment. They deserve your compassion. And the more you connect to this inner voice, the more you will discover the soul of compassion that is within you, that looks at you with so much love, and with everybody else on the earth with so much love. And if we all took the journey to become more connected to that inner voice, whatever our individual way is of accessing it, of reaching it, you don't have to sit with a journal every day like I do, because that might not be your way. And we're going to talk more about that in the next episode. You don't have to believe in a benevolent universe. You don't have to believe in a world of energy or spirituality or anything at all. And you still get to access the inner core of you and feel confident and capable and full of love and joy and fulfillment no matter what. It is for you too. I hope that by me sharing my story, it has in some way healed a little bit of whatever pain you have been through and given you some hope and encouragement that you can find your own inner voice, your own way of understanding and being with yourself that heals your pain and moves you forward. I hope you'll tune in next week when I talk more about how to access that place, how to understand those inner prompts that happen, how to interact with them, and how to use different access points if that very internal way of sitting with things is not for you, to find peace and healing and forward steps. And so if this part of the story has touched you or resonated with you, maybe share this episode with somebody else so that they too can benefit from what's coming next week when we'll go a little deeper again.